Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today for my presentation that is going to cover female health from a histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome perspective. And I'm going to talk you through some of the classical biology and some of the classical interventions that are used in these particular types of presentations, and also talk you through the quantum biology approach that I use in clinical practice. And the reason I've stumbled across quantum biology is through connecting with various different research groups, doing some projects, but also seeing an increase in the level of complexity in clinical practice. And I'm finding that many people are coming to me unable to tolerate standard interventions. So, a little bit about me, which you can read when you download the slides. So, let's start with an introduction to histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome. So, first, it is important to understand where histamine comes from. So, it is produced primarily from the amino acid histidine that we get from consuming protein. Now, we also get histamine directly from food sources. So, there are many foods that actually have histamine within them, and we also produce histamine in the gut by some bacterial species. Now, once histamine is produced, it is stored in various sites in the body, such as the histaminergic neurons within the brain, the basophils, the mast cells, and the enterochromaffin-like cells within the stomach. And then once histamine is released, it's going to dock with various different histamine receptors which exert a specific reaction. So histamine receptor 1 is generally involved in allergic type reactions. Histamine receptor 2 traditionally will start to produce gastric acid secretion, but it also helps to modulate heart rate and is involved in smooth muscle relaxation. Then histamine receptor 3, that is involved in neurotransmitter release and regulation. It's involved in the sleep-wake cycle and appetite regulation. Whereas histamine receptor 4 is involved in immune cell chemotaxis, inflammatory response modulation, and also has a very similar mechanism of action to histamine receptor 1. So, what's important when we start to look at our clients, and potentially they're going to be coming to us having taken kind of antihistamines for a long time, and they may be experiencing still symptoms of kind of a histamine type reaction. And that's because most of the medications that are available and that are prescribed are available as H1 and H2 blockers, therefore leaving kind of 3 and 4 unblocked, which is why a lot of people will start to lose tolerance or start to experience more reactions the longer that they're taking antihistamines. And then this is just to explain that histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome are two very different conditions. So, histamine intolerance is basically just the body's inability to appropriately break down histamine that's either produced in the body or consumed through the diet. And we have various enzyme pathways that histamine will be degraded through. Whereas mast cell activation syndrome is an immunological reaction where the mast cells are inappropriately and excessively releasing their chemical mediators. And people can experience both histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome at the same time, or they can experience just mast cell activation syndrome and not histamine intolerance, and vice versa. So within the spectrum of kind of what's happening with regards to histamine, there's a couple of things that I wanted to kind of differentiate here, because there's something called histamine intoxication, and this generally happens when someone consumes an excessive amount of histamine. So the Food Standards Agency have quite strict controls on the amount of histamine that's allowed to be produced in food, because as food is being degraded, it will generally produce histamine. So fish is a classic example of that. And if fish is allowed to generate so much histamine, it can produce something called skrumboid poisoning. And this is basically where so much histamine comes into the system that it actually overwhelms our natural detoxification enzymes. And those enzymes involved in kind of metabolizing histamine are the HNMT enzyme and the DAO enzyme pathways. And you can see here the excessive amount of histamine coming in, and there's just not enough enzymes, or it's overwhelming our natural ability to break down histamine. Where histamine intolerance is more to do with a deficiency of the enzymes that help to metabolize histamine. And those uh, that could be due to kind of genetic factors, or it could be that there are nutritional insufficiencies, um, particularly in things like copper and vitamin C, that can actually help these enzyme pathways work. So yeah, histamine intolerance is more to do with a lack of the ability to break down that histamine that's coming in through the diet or being produced by the body. And this slide is really to highlight the fact that mast cells aren't just a story of histamine. So a lot of practitioners who work with mast cell activation clients will often just focus in on histamine, but actually just looking at this slide, you can see that yes, mast cells do release histamine, but they release a ton of other chemical mediators, cytokines, chemokines, antimicrobial peptides, heparin. So there's a lot more going on in mast cell activation syndrome, as opposed to just excess histamine is being produced. And then this infographic is available for you to download with the slides. So this is just showing you the symptoms, the kind of overwhelming kind of ability for histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome to actually generate a large number of symptoms in clients. Now, the relationship between histamine mast cells and the female hormone cycle is quite complex, and it can affect various bodily functions. So, the primary female sex hormones are estrogen and progesterone, and they fluctuate during the typical menstrual cycle, during pregnancy, during puberty, and throughout the transition to menopause. And these hormones have distinct influences on mast cell behavior. So, estrogen promotes the activation of mast cells and can increase histamine release, but it also decreases the activity of the enzyme diamine oxidase needed to break down histamine. And the reason that estrogen does this, or the reason that this occurs within the female hormone cycle, is that, remember, mast cells release more than just histamine. They release a number of other important signaling molecules to ensure that the immune system is primed for a potential pregnancy, and it has the ability to cope with a potential attack of invading pathogens. But also, this kind of priming of the immune system will help to prevent the rejection of a pregnancy. And this is why I really love nature, because there is always balance within nature, and progesterone has the opposing effect on mast cells to estrogen. So progesterone is generally classed as having an anti-inflammatory effect, because it can help to reduce mast cell activation, but it also helps to enhance the production of DAO, which is the enzyme involved in breaking down histamine. So if you're looking at kind of the way a kind of normal menstrual cycle, um, what that actually looks like, you will see that during the menstrual phase, estrogen and progesterone levels are quite low, and you would expect at this time that histamine activity, mast cell activity, would be relatively balanced. And then during the follicular phase, estrogen levels, they'll start to rise in preparation for ovulation, which in turn, in some people, can lead to an increase in symptoms related to mast cell activation and histamine release, and also histamine intolerance, particularly in those who are susceptible and have other things kind of that are potentially activating that pathway as well. And then just before ovulation, you'll see this big surge in estrogen. Many women around this time will experience symptoms related to histamine and MCAS. And then during the luteal phase, after ovulation, progesterone levels should start to rise, and estrogen levels will decrease slightly. So, as I said, progesterone tends to stabilize mast cells and reduce histamine release. However, in women with low progesterone levels or who are extremely stressed, have HPA axis dysfunction, they may find that progesterone doesn't kick in enough, and this is where symptoms of HIT and MCAS can persist in this phase of the cycle. And I'll talk about the symptoms in the next slide to be looking out for. So, aside from the reproductive cycles, all women will experience two kind of significant events, which are puberty and menopause throughout their kind of reproductive history. Now, if you look at this great diagram here on the left, you will find this on Laura Bryden's Facebook page. And I really like it because you can see that during these phases of initial onset of periods and throughout the transition phase of perimenopause and menopause, there are large deficits in the amount of progesterone produced in these life stages. So, the progesterone's opposing and balancing effects on estrogen at these times is at risk of being insufficient. And all the while that you've got estrogen that's unopposed, mast cell activation symptoms or histamine intolerance symptoms can show up in susceptible individuals. So when you're looking at a client's timeline, it's really important to understand what has been going on through that whole life cycle of hormone health. And you can get some really good feedback on that based on some of the symptoms that people display around this time. So these symptoms include PMS, PMDD, anxiety disorders, depression, psychosis in some women, fainting, POTS, which is post-orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, PCOS, irregular periods, endometriosis, migraine, hives, vomiting, diarrhea, fatigue, nighttime flushing or hot flushing. That can actually be contributed to histamine, and also this presentation where women will describe waking up suddenly in the middle of the night, either sweating or having a hot flush and having kind of high levels of anxiety, heart palpitations, high heart rate, and I refer to these as histamine dumps. So that can be a quite classic picture, especially through that transition of perimenopause to menopause. There may be other things that you may notice when you start to dig into this. And women, particularly with MCAS and histamine intolerance, will report that they feel amazing during pregnancy. And this is because of the continuous release of progesterone, which is produced by the corpus luteum um, until about 12 weeks when the placenta actually takes over that role. And actually, when the placenta takes over, this is when you start to see a real upregulation of diamine oxidase. And the reason for that is, again, because we also have estrogen that's rising during pregnancy as well. So it's having this beneficial effect. But yes, a lot of women will experience a really beneficial, a really kind of healthy, feel great during pregnancy, and potentially maybe more at risk of postnatal depression due to that sharp decrease in progesterone and estrogen after they've given birth. So those are the things to look out for in a woman's timeline. Testing for histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome is inherently difficult because you generally need the person to be experiencing a flare to be able to catch the histamine metabolism markers in either the blood or the urine. Now, some private medical doctors will test for these, but generally when I kind of overview these tests, they always seem to be within the normal ranges unless they've been caught at the right time. In more extreme cases, a biopsy of the gut, bladder, or skin can be taken to assess the presence of high or abnormal levels of mast cells within the tissues. And then, as functional practitioners, we have the ability to do some genetic testing. So we can actually dig into the methylation pathways because that's quite important with regards to metabolizing histamine. But we can also look at the actual histamine breakdown pathways as well. And although it's not a diagnostic tool, it can really help with putting together some dietary and lifestyle interventions. So when you start to dig into the interventions that are generally used for these types of conditions, you're going to come across three main treatment strategies that are generally put in place. So we've got medications. Obviously, as nutritional therapists, we don't prescribe medications, but generally you will see people coming into your clinic on mast cell stabilizers or antihistamines. There are a ton of supplements available on the market that report to reduce the, excuse me, that report to reduce the effects of histamine or help with the detoxification of histamine. And then there's the low histamine diet. So you can find plenty of information on that throughout the, the the internet. I would direct you to a website called Mast Cell 360, which is a really good resource if you're just starting to learn about this. But in my clinic, I work with really complex cases, and I generally work with people who have tried these interventions. What's happened is the low histamine diet has turned into only being able to tolerate between 2 and 10 foods. They're unable to tolerate supplements and they're reacting to medications. And that's because these approaches generally work on suppression as opposed to trying to work out what the root cause is. So what are some of these kind of what I call root causes? So this is what I've put together, the chronic illness bucket. And as you can see, there are multiple factors that can kind of contribute to what actually goes into the bucket with regards to the ability to activate mast cells and produce kind of histamine intolerance type symptoms. So from my perspective, a number of factors play into this pathway. So we've got everything kind of coming in the bucket, which is artificial light, non-native electromagnetic frequency exposure, dehydration, circadian misalignment. The microbiome and digestive health plays into this, medications, supplements, foods, drinks, environmental toxins. So we start going into molds, we start going into dust and pets and those types of environmental allergies, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, hormone imbalance, and then current and latent pathogens. And that's when you go off into kind of Lyme, Bartonella, Epstein-Barr, herpes virus. All of that's all well and good, and we can start to take pressure off of those elements. But really, what we want to be focusing on first is kind of opening up this bucket, drilling a hole in the bucket, and allowing it to drain effectively. And so we can do that by assessing people's epigenetics and trying to get those balanced. Trauma plays into this picture as well, but that's beyond the scope of this presentation. But what I work on, and the first thing that I do is this concept of redox before detox, because if you start to detox someone in with chronic illness, because they're already creating a lot of reactive oxygen species, their detoxification capacity is likely overwhelmed. If you start to detox, you're just going to increase the pressure on the body and activate mast cells and put them right back to kind of being really, really poorly. So this concept of redox before detox is the approach that I've been using. Now, mast cell activation leads to a production of reactive oxygen species or an increased production of oxidative stress that really pull on the antioxidant reserves. And I think of biochemistry now in the form of electrons and protons. And when someone has this kind of highly oxidative, a lot of reactive oxygen species going on, they have a deficit of electrons. That's kind of the simplest way to kind of get it. So we need to get our electrons. We need to get electrons from our environment, and I'm going to talk you through how we're going to do that. But some signs that people would display that will kind of indicate that you need to do this redox before detox are, having MCAS, mycotoxin illness, reactivated pathogens, Lyme, Bartonella, loss of libido, decline in quality of hair, skin, and nails, poor sleep, decline in vision, a lack of dreams, disruption to cholesterol. So either really, really low LDL or really high LDL, lack of natural sunlight, high levels of artificial light exposure, altered hormone panels, low vitamin D, neurotransmitter imbalances, and dehydration. So as I say, I work with really complex clients. So generally, I don't use supplements, and it's really difficult to kind of put in place a nutrition plan when people are only tolerating a handful of foods. So this is where I've developed this different approach in clinical practice. So we're going to talk about light, water, and magnetism, and we're going to focus on light first. So our cells have been found in experiments to emit visible light in the visible light and non-visible light spectrums. And this light that the cells emit are referred to as biophotons. And biophotons have been found to act like non-chemical cell communicators. So effectively, they send messages or signals within this light to other cells, or they can kind of radiate from our body. And this is the concept of where the aura comes from if you are into kind of spirituality and metaphysics. Now, this is a really evolving area of research. So we haven't, or the research hasn't determined exactly what these biophotons are doing within our biochemistry, but we can start to make some assumptions when we start to dig into some of the structures within our body. So when we look at the structure of histidine, which is an aromatic amino acid, you will see here that it has a structure which is called an aromatic ring. And in the case of histidine, this is the imazidol ring. So this imazidol ring and other aromatic rings on other amino acids are able to absorb UV light. And this is where things get really interesting, because when we think about what Einstein was telling us about energy, is basically mass times the speed of light squared. What these aromatic structures are potentially doing is capturing light, slowing it down into mass, and creating it into energy. So when we think about this in the context of breaking down histamine, and I'm not going to talk through this slide in any great detail because I really don't have the time to go into it, but you have histamine that's degraded through the gastrointestinal tract and through systemic circulation. And every single pathway that it goes through, you end up with a metabolite that contains this imazidol ring. So the whole way through this pathway, these structures are able to respond to UV light. And then there's an offshoot of this pathway. Histidine will also convert to uricanic acid, which has some really interesting biochemical reactions with regards to the skin, how we absorb UV light, how we communicate UV light throughout the rest of the system. From that pathway, we can actually produce UV light biophotons by degrading reactive oxygen species. And in this particular, in the uricanic acid pathway, that will be the degradation of, or the metabolism of, hydrogen peroxide, and that releases an ultra weak ultraviolet biophoton. So we produce UV within our body, but we also get it from the sun. And this is where I want to bring in circadian rhythms, because the circadian rhythms, our bodies, our eyes, our skin, our metabolism is hugely responsive to the light and dark signals from the spectrums of light that we get from both the sun in the visible and non-visible spectrums. So the non-visible spectrums are in the ultraviolet and the infrared ranges, and the visible light is more about the colors of the rainbow that we can see. And what's really important is that these natural light signals will control our endocrine function, our immune cells, including mast cells. It will support digestion, and there's actually research now to suggest that certain spectrums of light actually enhance the integrity of the microbiome. So pretty much every single biochemical process is controlled by light through our circadian rhythms. And this slide will show you that we have visible light spectrums available throughout the whole of the daylight times, as well as infrared. Now, UVA and UVB are a little bit different. So UVA is available all year round in the UK, and it generally comes in kind of in the morning and will go in the afternoon, whereas UVB, that's available throughout the spring, summer months, and it disappears around October time. And that's the important spectrum of light that helps us with vitamin D. There's a whole nother presentation on kind of how we utilize this light for our metabolism, which I will hope to be presenting on in the new year. And our light and dark cycles are really, so the dark cycles are all about rest, repair, regeneration. But what's really key here is that melatonin, the hormone that's in charge during the nighttime, is a potent mast cell stabilizer. So coming back to these women that are waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning with histamine dumps, it is likely that their circadian rhythms are misaligned and they're not producing enough melatonin to facilitate a full night's sleep. And then our light cycles, that's when we want to be active, we want to have balanced stress responses, we want to be consuming food, digesting and absorbing. This slide shows you the evolution of light over time. So as humans, we've evolved under natural light spectrums of the sun, firelight and candlelight, and fast forward to now, where the majority of our lighting comes from artificial sources in the LED spectrum within the blue spectrum. And there is a big problem with this because LED lights in both artificial lighting and what we get from screens and devices exposes our eyes to an unnatural amount of unopposed blue light. So when we think of these visible light spectrums that are available to us in the sun from the sun, yes, we do get exposed to blue, but that's in conjunction with the other colors of the spectrum, which negate the harmful effects of just being irradiated with one color on a permanent basis. Now, cortisol, so blue light that comes in through our eyes unopposed, activates cortisol, drives up insulin, it destroys melatonin, and is involved in lipid oxidation. So you can see that there is a massive problem if blue light is dominant in people's lives throughout the whole of the day, through office lighting, gym lighting, home lighting, screens, devices, and then that's continuing in the evening and at night time. So what's really important here is that anything that destabilizes circadian rhythms will destabilize mast cells, and there's a study here that will you can dig into. So what I get people to do, connect with nature. I get people to be outside when the sun is coming up and when the sun is setting. And I get people to mitigate. The first thing I do is get people to mitigate that artificial light at night. That's either through, you can change your lighting. There's a company called www.blockbluelight.co.uk. So they do all forms of lighting. Just dimming the lights in the evening, getting the blue light off of screens, and just really educating clients on how detrimental looking at social media at night. So getting people to really start to think about doing a restorative evening routine that really reduces the exposure to this artificial light at night. And if people really are going to struggle with that, then I get them wearing blue light blocking glasses. Now I'm going to skim past these next two sections because I am running out of time, but I'm going to talk you through water. And I want to point you to a researcher called Gerald Pollack, who has discovered the fourth phase of water. And he has a book called The Fourth Phase of Water that I would really encourage you all to read. Now, his research is based on the work of Dr. Gilbert Ling, who was really pulling on other researchers with regards to really analyzing how water structures itself. And he did find that water, when it is structured, it forms this hexagonal shape, which traps pollutants within this hexagonal shape. And this type of structured water actually starts to form on hydrophilic surfaces. So any hydrophilic surface within the body will start to form this structured water. Now, what Gerald Pollack has done is he's really taken this research to the next level. And so what he's discovered is that in our body, we have the ability to structure this water against our cell membranes and other structures which are hydrophilic. And what happens is the structured water starts to layer upon layer upon layer upon itself. And what that does is provides really beneficial properties to our health, because what the structure does is it actually generates energy. It creates energy the same way that a battery does. So this will enhance cellular interactions. It facilitates signal transmission and protein function. It creates a cleaner environment for the cell, so it traps problematic particles and it supports the stability and the organization of biochemical molecules and cells and also cell receptors. And this is important in MCAS because the exclusion zone can help to stabilize cell membranes and receptors and provides an exclusion zone to prevent unwanted particles entering the cell and potentially activating all this mast cell degranulation. And so, in his experiments in his laboratory, he's found that glyphosate in particular is particularly detrimental at reducing this exclusion zone water, completely destroys it. Whereas other things can be helpful. So, MCAS friendly interventions that can help is sunlight exposure. So, again, sunrises and sunsets are really gentle for people who are hyperactivated. Things like grounding, juicing green vegetables, because the plants already have their own exclusion or structured water within them. Consuming healthy fats, minimizing EMFs and artificial blue light, and of course, avoiding glyphosate and fluoride as much as possible. And then I'm going to talk you through magnetism. So this really applies to people who you've been working with who are really not improving, irrespective of doing SIBO work, dietary changes, addressing mold and reactivated pathogens. We need to look a little bit further into their environment. Now, the World Health Organization have acknowledged that there is a condition called electromagnetic hypersensitivity. And when you start to dig into some of the symptoms, they really do mimic those of mast cell activation syndrome and other kind of conditions within that spectrum. And so something that I get my clients to do is really look at mitigating their EMF exposure, turning off their Wi-Fi at night, making sure devices are not being charged in the bedroom. I get people to take their televisions out of their room or turn them off at the plug. And then if you want to do some research into this, there is plenty of research on PubMed. And I wanted to highlight this one. This is a rat study, but nonetheless, it showed that when pregnant rats were exposed to EMFs from mobile devices and Wi-Fi, it altered the hormone levels in those pregnant rats. And here's just a link to another study that shows that radiation can activate mast cells. And here's another study here. So the sources of electromagnetic frequencies will come from non-native or man-made or natural sources. So the natural sources that we're generally exposed to are from the spectrums of light that we're exposed to. And then we've got the Schumann resonance, or the Earth's natural magnetic field that is meant to be healthy and balanced for us, clearly, because we evolved with it. And then we've got kind of the non-native spectrum of electromagnetic frequencies. So we've got communication towers, Wi-Fi, satellite, telephone wires, Wi-Fi routers. So all of those things will come into play. And as technology is improving, you're going to see lots of your clients who are completely wired in. They've got Bluetooth through their home. They've got Apple devices everywhere that are all synced up with each other. So particularly in people who are ultimately sensitive, we need to think about how we're going to balance that. And again, because of this increase in technology, it's almost getting to the point where it's impossible to avoid it. So what we need to do is be more consciously aware of it and put in place some interventions. And this is where I really coach my clients on balancing nature with tech. And I do that through grounding. I'm really sorry that I'm rushing through this, but you can read through these slides when you get to download them. But grounding in nature is the kind of stabilization that people need if they're being affected by electromagnetic frequencies. And there's these 3 books that I have found have been really helpful for kind of enhancing my knowledge in these particular areas. And if you're interested, I would really urge that you kind of get these books and read them and really dig into kind of this new world of electromagnetism, because it really does help to improve client outcomes. So summary of interventions then that I talk my clients through is the circadian reset, building exclusion zone water and grounding in nature. And that's really, all people need in those foundational stages, particularly when they're really hypersensitive and you can't work within the spectrum of supplements and diet. And then obviously the importance of language, making sure that your language isn't inflammatory or scary when you're presenting information to clients. And then I take people through the practice of recovery, which is a structured journal exercise, which helps to kind of facilitate that kind of healing process from a subconscious level within the body. And then just wanted to highlight a couple of cases where I've used these interventions and had really quick turnaround of symptoms. So case one, a lady had MCAS and perimenopause. Within 3 weeks, was generally less reactive and is now successfully moving through a food reintroduction plan. Case study two, we had all sorts of things going on here. So Lyme, Bartonella, Epstein-Barr, long COVID, MCAS POTS. She was bedbound and also going through perimenopause. And within 2 weeks, she was up and out of bed. I'm not saying she was majorly cured or, going about day-to-day activities, but she was able to engage in certain activities and get herself out of bed. And after 3 months, her cycles normalized. And then a case of biotoxin illness. So a client of mine, we discovered that there was mycotoxin or a significant mold problem. So after remediation, we did the circadian rhythm retraining, we did gut support, and actually she'd lost her periods due to mycotoxin exposure, but very, very quickly her periods came back online using some of these interventions. So thank you so much for listening. There's a lot of information on there in there to unpack. So if you're interested in learning more, you can scan this QR code and connect up with me. I've really enjoyed presenting with you today, and I hope to see you again in another learning session. Thank you so much.